Welcome to the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. This lecture is intended for students who are enrolled in the Academy's Classical Reasoning 1 course. If you're not enrolled and would like to join us for self-paced studies, please visit our website at classicalliberalarts.com. My name is William Michael. I'm the Academy headmaster, and I'll be leading this study of Chapter 3 of Porphyry's Introduction. We're studying the third chapter in Porphyry's Introduction. This will be the fourth lecture on this work. Chapter 2 consisted of 2 lectures, so we're moving into Chapter 3, which treats of the topic of difference. Chapter 2 introduced genus and species. Chapter 3 deals with the third, predicable, which is difference. Porphyry was a Platonic philosopher. He lived in the 3rd and into the 4th century after Christ, and he wrote this introduction around 270 AD. It was intended to serve as a guide to help students prepare for and understand Aristotle's Categories. Aristotle's Categories is the first book of his work on the art of reasoning. Very difficult study that many avoid, has led to many problems in Christian history because people simply didn't like being accountable to Aristotelian philosophy. But Porphyry provides us with a guide to help prepare us. And I always stress the chronology of these philosophers and works that we study. Aristotle wrote the Categories around 350 BC, and here we're reading Porphyry's Introduction, which was written around 268 AD. So keep those dates in mind as you study. Porphyry is writing centuries after Aristotle, providing a helpful introduction to his work on reasoning. The subject of Porphyry's Introduction is a study of 5 important terms that are used in the works of Aristotle, which are called the 5 predicables. 5 different types of predicates, or things that can be spoken about a subject. And the 5 predicables are genus, species, difference, property, and accident. In Chapter 2, as I mentioned, we looked in detail at genus and species, and in this lesson, Chapter 3, we're going to take up difference. These are basic ways that we can speak about things and classify them according to their natures. And remember, everything we're talking about in this subject has to do with ideas and words. This is a logic study. This is rational philosophy. We're talking about ideas and words. This is not a biology class. So when we talk about classification, don't think about the classification of plants or animals. We're talking about ideas and words in the soul. So we're studying the 5 predicables, and we're working on the third of the 5 predicables, which is difference. We focus entirely on difference in this chapter, so it's not nearly as long as Chapter 2, and all of our attention will be on one subject, difference. This text, it's important to remember, the study of Porphyry's Introduction became very influential on medieval Catholic philosophers. And anytime we find the works of Aristotle published in the Middle Ages, we often find Porphyry's Introduction added to the text with the works of Aristotle. It was considered essential study. There were a few other works like this that were considered essential for classical studies. We find them, for example, in the works of St. Albert the Great, because he commented on works like these, and we can see how significant they were because they received so much attention from these great Catholic philosophers, doctors of the church even. So let's go ahead and get started with this study. Again, Chapter 3 of Porphyry's Introduction. But before we begin, let's take a moment and commit our time to the Lord and ask for His blessing upon our studies. Let us pray. Lord our God, in your wisdom and love, you surround us with the mysteries of the universe. Send your Spirit upon us and fill us with your wisdom and blessings. Grant that we may devote ourselves to our studies and draw ever closer to you, the source of all knowledge. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Before moving on with this lecture, make sure that you have made a first reading of Chapter 3. So if you haven't done that yet, hit pause, go do your reading, and then come back for the lecture. If you've already read through Chapter 3, and I'm not kidding, you need to read the chapter before studying the lecture, so please do that first. And if you already have, let's go ahead and get to the division of the content of the chapter. We're going to divide Chapter 3 into 6 different parts. We're dividing Chapter 3 into 6 different parts. So let's just go through these, and then we'll dig into the actual study of all of the content. Part 1, beginning at the top of the chapter, opens with difference, however, is predicated in common, and so on. And the title we'll give to this first part is The Three Types of Difference. The Three Types of Difference. The second part of the chapter begins in section 5 with the sentence, universally, therefore, every difference. Part 2 begins at universally, therefore, every difference. And Part 2 covers the effects of different types of difference. Part 3 begins at beginning, therefore, again. Beginning, therefore, again. That's the beginning of Part 3, which covers separable and inseparable differences. Part 4 deals with essential differences and the role that they play in classification. It begins at since, therefore, 3 species of difference, where you see since, therefore, 3 species of difference in the text. That's the beginning of Part 4 on essential differences and their role in classification. Part 5 of Chapter 3 begins where we read, these also defining, they say difference. These also defining, they say difference, and so on. Part 5 covers formal definitions of difference. Formal definitions of difference. And lastly, Part 6 is a conclusion on what are called specific differences, and that begins where we read, thus much may suffice concerning difference. Thus much may suffice concerning difference. So we'll divide Chapter 3 into these 6 parts for the sake of an orderly study. So having read the chapter by now, as you're supposed to have done, and having divided the chapter into these 6 parts, let's go ahead, roll up our sleeves, and dig in to the interpretation and study of all of the content of Chapter 3. We begin the first section with Porphyry writing, quote, difference, however, is predicated in common, peculiarly, and most peculiarly. Difference is predicated in common, peculiarly, and most peculiarly. So as we've seen in previous chapters, Porphyry begins by telling us that the word difference can be used in 3 different ways. And again, that's one of the reasons why these terms are confusing, because they have a number of different possible meanings. Difference can be used in 3 different ways. He says in common, peculiarly, and most peculiarly. Those are the 3 ways that difference can be used. This is important because in philosophy, we have to be precise about the meanings of words that we use. When we say that 2 things differ, we might mean 3 different things, because there are 3 different kinds or senses of difference. Porphyry wants to make sure that we understand each of these types clearly, because as a good teacher, he wants us to be able to understand what we're studying. And Porphyry's systematic approach reflects the scholastic method of careful distinction-making that helps us to think clearly. And we want to develop this discipline, this carefulness in thinking, both as students and also as teachers. So as we see the carefulness, the exactness that Porphyry shows in his teaching, we want to learn from his example and imitate that exactness in our own teaching, in our own thinking, and so on. Porphyry goes on to write, quote, "One thing is said to differ from another in common, in consequence of differing in some respect or other, either from itself or from something else. One thing is said to differ from another in common," that is the first sense, "in consequence of differing in some respect or other, either from itself or from something else. For Socrates differs from Plato in being another person, and he differs from himself when he was a boy, and when he becomes a man, and when he does anything or ceases to do it. Difference is always perceived in the various ways in which a thing is, after a certain manner, affected with an A, affected. So this first type of difference is called common difference. Common difference. This is the most general way that things can differ. Socrates differs from Plato simply because they're 2 different people. It's obvious. But Porphyry also points out something that's interesting. Socrates can be said to differ from himself at different times. The boy, Socrates, and the man, Socrates, are the same person, but they differ in many ways. This shows us that difference doesn't always mean we're talking about completely separate things. Even the same thing can differ from itself over time in different circumstances, and so on. When Porphyry says, quote, "Difference is always perceived in the various ways in which a thing is after a certain manner affected," he means that we notice differences by observing how things are changed or modified in various ways. This connects for us the scholastic understanding that change involves the actualization of potential. You'll come across these terms, actualization and potential, actuality, potentiality. If you read Thomas Aquinas, we see this present in this understanding of the concept of difference. Socrates the boy had the potential to become Socrates the man. We see differences even in the same person or same subject. Porphyry goes on and says, quote, "But one thing is said to differ peculiarly from another," the second sense of difference. One thing is said to differ peculiarly from another when one thing differs from another by an inseparable accident. One thing is said to differ peculiarly from another when one thing differs from another by an inseparable accident. and an inseparable accident is such as the azure or blue color of the eye, the crookedness of the nose, or a scar from a wound when it becomes scurrous. So things are said to differ peculiarly when they differ by an inseparable accident. This second type of difference is called peculiar difference. Porphyry introduces this important concept of an inseparable accident. An accident, and for students new to philosophy, especially younger students who are getting a head start on the study of reasoning, we hear the word accident and we think of a car crash. We think of a mistake that's made. That's not at all what's meant here by this word accident. In scholastic philosophy, an accident is a quality that belongs to something but is not part of its essential nature. An accident is a quality that belongs to something but is not a part of its essential nature. Most accidents are called separable. You can remove them from something without destroying that thing. But some accidents become so permanently attached that they can't be separated. An example that's given here by Porphyry is the color of someone's eyes. The color of a man's eyes are an accident. But it's an accident that can't be taken away. It's an accident that doesn't change. It's accidental to the person, but it's permanent. It stays with the person. It is an inseparable accident. The blue color of someone's eyes, a crooked nose, a permanent scar. These are all examples of inseparable accidents. We can think about crime investigators who look for marks on people's bodies to identify them, a tattoo, a scar, any kind of noticeable difference. We can see that what they're looking for is a peculiar difference, a differ in an inseparable accident. These differences are more significant than common differences we just looked at because they're permanent features. But they still don't change what the thing essentially is. A person with blue eyes is essentially human, just as much as a person with brown eyes or green eyes. So it has nothing to do with their essential character or their substance. But the accident can be separable or inseparable. And when we have an inseparable accident that causes two things to differ, we're talking about a peculiar difference. Porphyry goes on and says, quote, "One thing also is said to differ most peculiarly from another." So here's the third sense of difference. One thing is said to differ most peculiarly from another when it varies from it by a specific difference. One thing is said to differ most peculiarly from another when it varies from it by a specific difference. Thus, man differs from horse by a specific difference, namely by the quality of being rational. So when two things differ and what causes them to differ is a specific difference, they differ most peculiarly. So we have common difference, peculiar difference, and most peculiar difference, the three senses or three kinds of difference. This third and most important type is, again, called most peculiar difference. Porphyry also calls this specific difference. So those two terms are the same thing. Most peculiar difference and specific difference. And remember, when you see that word specific, what you should notice in it is the word species. The difference that actually produces species. That's what a specific difference is. This is the difference that actually makes something to be the kind of thing or species that it is. Man, as Porphyry explains, differs from horse not just accidentally, but essentially by the quality of being rational. This difference of being rational or irrational is so fundamental that it determines what species each of these two animals belongs to. It's a specific difference. It's a difference that actually separates two things into different species. This idea here connects for us Aristotelian and Thomistic or scholastic teaching about substantial forms. The rational soul, as we'll learn when we get into Aristotelian philosophy, the rational soul is the substantial form of man, making him essentially different from other animals. Porphyry continues, quote, "Universally, therefore, every difference, when connected with anything, causes that thing to be altered. Every difference causes a thing to be altered. But differences which subsist in common and peculiarly cause a thing to be different in quality. Differences which are most peculiar cause one thing to be another thing." That's an important line. Differences which subsist in common and peculiarly, the first two kinds of difference, cause a thing to be different in quality. Notice it says, cause a thing to be different in quality. But the differences which are most peculiar cause a thing to be another thing. Notice that difference in species or kind. Porphyry explains that the effects, or he explains what are the effects of these different types of difference, why they're important. All differences cause some kind of change or alteration, but the type of change depends on the type of difference. Common and peculiar differences change the quality of something. They make it different in some way, but it remains the same kind of thing. But specific differences make something to be a completely different kind of thing. So we can see why understanding these different senses of the term difference is so important. The different kinds of differences actually have important consequences. They have important effects in philosophy. This distinction that we're learning here is crucial in scholastic philosophy because it relates to the difference between an accidental change or a change in quality and a substantial change, a change in being. So I don't expect you to understand all of these things or be familiar with some of the consequences that I talk about, but I simply want you to see that these concepts that Porphyry is clarifying for us are going to be very important in our future studies in philosophy. They're going to help us to understand the philosophy, and the great philosophers did in fact understand these things, and we need to understand them in order to understand those philosophers. Porphyry continues, "Hence, those differences which cause a thing to be another thing are called specific differences. But those which cause it to be changed in quality are simple differences. For the difference of rational acceding to animal causes it to be another thing, and makes it to be a species of animal. But the difference of being moved makes it to differ in quality alone from that which is at rest. Hence, the one makes it to be another thing, but the other only makes it to be different in quality. When you read this, you have to be careful because you have to make sure you understand the content so that you can see important phrases and read them with proper expression. I'd like to just read that again and show you a few examples of this. Sometimes I like to just record the readings of lessons for my students because when students are new to a subject, it's hard sometimes to even read the sentences with proper articulation, with proper emphasis, and so on, because they really don't understand the meaning or what's being said in the sentences. So just listen as I read this again, and I'm going to really make the different ideas clear by adding extra emphasis. Porphyry writes, "Those differences which cause a thing to be another thing are called specific differences. But those which cause it to be changed in quality are called simple differences." So specific differences and simple differences. Simple differences would include common and peculiar differences. The difference of rational, so the specific difference he's mentioning is rational. The difference of rational exceeding or being added to animal causes it to be another thing, a different species, makes it to be a species of animal. So we have animal as the genus. And if we start with something and remember, ask the question, what is it? The answer to that question will be the genus. It is an animal. But if we add the difference rational to an animal, that will change what kind of thing it is, because rational is a specific difference. So it will identify that this is a certain species of animal. A rational animal identifies a certain species of animal, namely rational animal, which will include man. So rational exceeding to animal, with the difference rational being added to animal, causes it to be another thing, makes it to be a species of animal. But the difference of, quote-unquote, being moved, that's the emphasis I want to make sure you see there. The difference of being moved makes it to differ in quality alone from that which is, quote, at rest, unquote. So he compares two different differences here. Rational would be a specific difference. Being moved would be a simple difference. Causes the thing to differ in quality alone from something that is at rest. Hence, the one, the specific difference, makes the subject to be another thing. But the other, the simple difference, only makes it to be different in quality. Porphyry gives us here clear names for these two main categories of differences: specific differences and simple differences. When we add rational to animal, we get a new species, man. This is a specific difference because it creates a new kind of being. But when something moves from rest to motion, it's still the same thing, just in a different state. This is a simple difference, affecting only the quality of a thing. Again, this distinction between specific and simple differences will help us when we study scholastic philosophy and learn about the hierarchy of being and the importance of substantial forms in determining what things are. So that teaching in scholastic philosophy is drawn from this important distinction in different kinds of differences and an understanding of the five predicables. Porphyry continues and says, quote, "According to specific differences, therefore, which cause a thing to be another thing, the divisions of genera into species are produced, and the definitions are assigned which consist from genus and differences of this kind. Very important sentence there. The divisions of genera into species are produced, and definitions are assigned which consist from genus and specific differences. But according to those differences which alone cause a thing to be different in quality, alterations are constituted, and the mutations of that which subsists after a certain manner. So Porphyry here explains, again, the practical importance of this study, the practical importance of understanding different kinds of differences. Specific differences, like rational, are what we use to philosophically divide categories, genera, into more specific categories, species. So it's not just random. This is important. This is an important lesson to learn as you get into rational philosophy. The dividing of a genus into species is not just random. You can't pick whatever quality you want. You can't look at animals and just say, let's set them into two different groups. Let's say animals with wings and animals that don't have wings. That's a difference between different animals, but that's not a specific difference that divides animals into its true species. Rational would be the specific difference. So we can't just divide genera into any groups that we want. There's one specific difference that divides a genus into species. Not only are these specific differences important for dividing a genus into its true species, but they're also essential for creating true definitions. True definitions. I think I mentioned in an earlier lecture there's a difference between a definition and a description. If I were to ask you to define a cat and you were to say something like a cat is a furry domestic animal that chases mice, you haven't given a definition of a cat. You've simply described a cat. So a description might help us to identify someone or something, but it's not a definition. We've got to understand the genus of a thing and its specific difference to actually define a thing properly. We define man, for example, as a rational animal. And that's not just random. We don't just pick whatever features we want to. We define man as a rational animal. We start by naming the genus of the thing. We say that man is an animal. And then we add the specific difference, rational. That's the formula for a true definition. The genus plus the specific difference. So if you don't understand specific differences, if you don't understand what a genus is, you can't make definitions. That's how important this is. So the next time you open a dictionary and look up a word and then read what's given as its definition, you can evaluate that definition and decide whether it is a true definition or merely a description. And if you find that the dictionary is in fact filled with true definitions, you can see just how significant, how philosophical a dictionary can be. It's very difficult to actually define terms truly. So that's what we get from genus and specific differences. Simple differences, though, they only account for changes in something over time. They belong to descriptions. And again, this prepares us for the study of the scholastic method of definition, which we'll see used by St. Thomas Aquinas all through his writings. When you see a wise man like St. Thomas or St. Albert or some doctor of the church, when you see them define a term, Now you'll understand what exactly they're doing to establish that definition. Very important. Porphyry continues, quote, "Beginning therefore again, we must say that of differences, some are separable, but others are inseparable. For to be moved and to be at rest, to be ill and to be well, and such things as are similar to these are separable differences. But to have a crooked or a flat nose, to be rational or irrational, these are inseparable differences," unquote. So now Porphyry is presenting a different way of looking at differences, a different way of classifying differences. And this is between separable differences and inseparable differences. And I think the difference here is pretty easy to understand. Separable, able to be separated, and inseparable, unable to be separated. Separable differences can come and go without changing the essential nature of a thing. You can be healthy today, and you can be sick tomorrow. You can be moving at the present moment and then be at rest. But you remain the same person, the same thing. Inseparable differences cannot be removed without destroying or fundamentally changing the subject. Having a crooked nose, for example, Aristotle always likes to talk about crooked noses. Having a crooked nose might be permanent. It's not a specific difference, but it is an inseparable difference. It can't be taken away, or at least not easily. Being rational or irrational certainly can't be changed without changing what kind of thing you are, what kind of being you are. So this distinction that Porphyry introduces here helps us to understand which qualities are essential to things and which are merely accidental. Accidental things are separable. More essential things are inseparable. So it's an important distinction to make. Moving on, Porphyry says, quote, of inseparable differences that cannot be separated, some subsist essentially, but others from accident. Of inseparable differences, some subsist essentially, others subsist from accident. And remember, we said that this word subsist simply means to exist. Thus, Porphyry says, rational, mortal, and, quote, capable of receiving science, unquote, keep that whole phrase as a difference. So he gives us three differences there as examples. Rational is one, mortal is one, and then to be capable of receiving science, that whole phrase is a third example. These differences are essentially inherent in man. These are essentially inherent in man. But on the other hand, to have a crooked or flat nose, while that may be inseparable, these are inherent from accident and not essentially, unquote. So within inseparable differences, Porphyry makes another important distinction. He says that some inseparable differences are essential, or that they belong to the essence of a thing, and others are accidental. They can come and go. Some inseparable, I shouldn't say they can come and go. That's sloppy for me to say that, sorry. Porphyry distinguishes essential and accidental, inseparable differences. So they can't come and go. I don't want to say that. That was a bad choice of words. Essential means they actually subsist according to the essence of man, and accidental means that they subsist accidentally. They are not belonging to the essence of man. So two different kinds of inseparable differences. So examples of inseparable differences that would be essential would be rationality or mortality. The other one that he gives here is capable of receiving science. That's something that is essential to the nature of man. Science means scientific knowledge, a certain quality of knowledge. Other inseparable differences, even though they can't be separated, like a crooked nose, even though they can't be separated, they're accidental. They're not essential to man, as the example. So this distinction here, distinguishing between essential and accidental inseparable differences, and I know that's a mouthful. This again is fundamental to scholastic philosophy because it helps us understand what belongs to the definition of something and what doesn't. And if you say, well, why does that matter? Why is that going to be important? Because when we get into logical arguments, often a key component of a logical argument is a definition. And one fallacy, one example of false reasoning that we have to watch out for is that someone uses as a premise a statement that is not actually a definition. So you can see how understanding the nature of a definition helps us or will help us to evaluate the quality of arguments. So essential differences, again, tell us what a thing is. Accidental differences tell us how a particular thing happens to be. Porphyry continues and says, quote, "The differences, therefore, which are essentially present are assumed in the definition of essence, and they make a thing to be another thing. But those which are from accident are neither assumed in the definition of essence, nor do they make a thing to be another thing, but cause it as the same thing to be different in quality." He explains the practical consequences, again, of this distinction between essential and accidental differences. Essential differences must be included when we define what something is. They determine what species or kind of thing we're dealing with. They name a class, again. That's going to be very important when we get into the art of reasoning. Understanding the names and definitions of classes. Accidental differences, even if they're inseparable, they're not included in definitions, and they don't change the fundamental nature of a thing. When we define man as a rational animal, we include rationality in the definition of man because it's essential to man. But we don't include having a crooked nose or a certain shape of a nose because that's accidental. So we've got to be able to identify essential differences in order to rightly define things. Porphyry continues, quote, "Those differences which are essential," and here's basically how we can identify essential differences. "Differences which are essential do not admit of more and less." Differences which are essential do not admit of more and less. That is, they cannot be spoken of in degrees. So as far as definition is concerned, one man is not more rational than another man. They're both rational. That's an essential difference that marks them. Differences, however, which are from accident, even though they should be inseparable, admit of intention and remission. Intention means increase, remission means decrease. For neither is genus, or neither is a genus as a predicable, more and less predicated of that of which it is the genus, So man, for example, is not more animal than zebra. They're both animal in the same sense and in the same degree. Genus is not more or less predicated of that of which it is the genus, nor the differences of genus are they more and less according to which it is divided. These are the things which give completion to the definition of everything. But the essence of everything is one and the same, and neither admits of intention or remission. That's increase or decrease, more or less. To have a crooked or flat nose, however, or to be after a certain manner colored, do admit of intention and remission. One man may have a more crooked nose than another. One man may be more colored than another. So again, this is a way to distinguish, a way to identify essential and accidental differences. Essential differences do not admit of degrees. We don't speak of them as more or less, whereas accidental differences are spoken of with respect to degrees. So Porphyry explains here another important characteristic that distinguishes essential from accidental differences. Essential differences don't come in degrees. You're either rational as a man, or you're not as some other species of animal. You are either mortal or you aren't. There's no such thing as being more rational in the essential sense. Now, there may be an example of being more rational in a certain behavior, but that's something else. We're talking about the essence of a thing, and with respect to the essence of a thing, there's no difference. There's no more or less rational if you are a man. Accidental differences, on the other hand, can vary in degree. A nose can be more or less crooked, skin can be more or less colored, and so on. This is going to be important when we get into scholastic philosophy because essences are determinate, they're unchanging, and accidents can vary. This helps us to recognize what belongs to the core nature of things and what is merely a variable quality. A good example of this might be, thinking about music at Mass. If someone's upset that at church they use a certain kind of music, so he argues that this Mass is unacceptable, or this Mass is sinful because it uses some kind of music that he doesn't approve of. You see that the question is really whether or not the music is an essential characteristic of the liturgy of the Mass, or whether it's accidental. You can see how that simple distinction will make or break this man's accident. If it's merely accidental and can change or can vary from one Mass to another, then arguing that a Mass is evil or invalid because it uses a certain kind of music, it's not rational, it's not reasonable. Whereas if we found that a certain kind of music was in fact essential, then that argument might actually have some weight. So you can see how important this distinction can be. In many arguments, the problem is this kind of confusion. We're confusing essential and accidental differences and making too much of accidental or not enough of essential differences. Let's keep going here. Porphyry continues, quote, "Since, therefore, three species of difference, three different kinds of difference are beheld, some indeed are separable, others are inseparable, and of the inseparable some are essential, but others from accident. And again, of essential differences, some are those according to which we divide genera into species, but others are those according to which the things divided become specific. Thus, with respect to such differences of animal as the following, namely, animated and sensitive, rational and irrational, mortal and immortal. The difference of animated and sensitive is constitutive. Here's a new term. The difference of animated and sensitive is constitutive of the essence of animal. The difference of mortal and immortal, and also of rational and irrational, are divisive differences of animal. For through these we divide genera into species. Now this section, likely very difficult to understand when reading it on your own, but I want to ask you to focus on this section here because it's very important. He's getting back to that tree of Porphyry illustration that I advised you to look at in the previous lecture. And he's talking about how a genus is constituted and how a genus is divided. So constitutive differences which come together to form a genus, and divisive differences which separate a genus into species. So Porphyry here shows us how essential differences work in practice by distinguishing between constitutive, that is, remember the language in the previous lesson was collecting things together and moving upward in the logical hierarchy, collecting things together into genera. Constitutive differences, the differences which constitute a genus, and divisive differences, the differences which divide. And when we divide, we move downward in the logical hierarchy. We covered that in the second lecture of chapter 2. Constitutive differences are what makes a genus to be what it is. Animated and sensitive, for example, are what make animal to be animal, distinguishing it from plants. Plants are animated, but not sensitive. So, plants and animals have being animated in common. The difference between plants and animals is that plants are not sensitive and animals are sensitive. So the two differences taken together, animated and sensitive, constitute animal. Animated and not sensitive constitute plant. So you can see how the genera are constituted from these differences. What's what makes animal to be animal and distinguishes it from plants and from non-living things which will be not animated. Divisive differences, on the other hand, are what we use to divide a genus into its species. Rational and irrational are divisive differences. They are the differences that divide genus into its different species. Mortal and immortal are also divisive differences. They divide animals into different kinds, mortal and immortal. We could say into man and angels, or mortal animals and immortal animals. This systematic approach, and again, that's what science is, systematic knowledge. This systematic approach to classifying ideas and words together reflects the scholastic method of organizing knowledge according to the natural order of things. You can see how this is going to prepare you to appreciate Christian philosophy, which does this, which perfects this philosophy. Porphyry continues. These divisive differences, however, of genera give completion to and constitute species. The divisive differences of genera, notice divisive of genera, are constitutive to species. these divisive differences of genera give completion to and constitute species. Animal is divided by the difference of rational and irrational, and again by the difference of mortal and immortal. But the differences of rational and mortal taken together become constitutive of the species man. Those of rational and immortal, thinking in ancient pre-Christian terms or non-Christian terms, rational and immortal might be a god or an angel in Christian terms. Differences of mortal and irrational would be constitutive of the species of irrational animals or beasts. So, since the differences, animated and inanimate, sensitive and deprived of sense, we could say, or insensitive, since these divide essence or substance, which is arranged in the highest place as the most general genus, animated and sensitive, when added to the genus essence, form animal, which is a species with reference to essence, but is a genus with reference to that which is beneath it. But animated and deprived of sense, again, form plant. So this section here in Porphyry demonstrates how the same differences can be divisive at one level, dividing a genus into species, but constitutive at another. Rational and mortal, for example, divide the genus animal. They're divisive with respect to the genus animal, but they're constitutive with respect to the species man. And so this shows us how this whole work of classification actually works, how it works hierarchically as this whole system. We start with the broadest categories, and then we narrow them down by adding specific differences. We start with the broadest categories, and we narrow them down by adding specific differences. The examples that Porphyry shows us show the traditional classification of things. Substance at the top, and remember, essence and substance are used as synonyms. They mean the same thing. Substance divides into animate and inanimate. Animate substance divides into sensitive and non-sensitive. Sensitive is animal, non-sensitive is plant. Animals then divide into rational and irrational. Rational animals divide into mortal, humans, and immortal, angels or gods. This hierarchical understanding which Porphyry is describing here, which was taught in Aristotle, is the scholastic view, is the Christian philosophical view of what's called the chain of being. So this philosophy, this ancient Aristotelian philosophy, becomes Christian philosophy because it's true. So not only in studying Porphyry, not only are we going to be able to understand the writings of Aristotle, but we're also going to be able to understand the writings of great Christian philosophers like St. Albert the Great, St. Thomas Aquinas, and so on, in future theology courses. Porphyry continues and says, since, therefore, the same differences, assumed in a certain respect, become constitutive, and in a certain respect become divisive, all of them are called specific. Since the same differences assumed in a certain respect become constitutive, that is, forming larger classes or genera, and in a certain respect become divisive, that is, breaking genera into species, all of them are called specific. So Porphyry concludes this section by noting that because these essential differences divide genera and constitute species, they're all called in a proper way specific differences. This terminology that we're learning here from Porphyry is important because it shows that the same difference can function in a number of different ways depending on the level of classification that we're considering. This flexibility in the way that this system works reflects a scholastic understanding or leads to a scholastic understanding that reality is organized in a rational, hierarchical way that human minds can discover and understand. So you can see the significance of this truth that exists in reality is discernible by the human mind, is discoverable by the human mind. God made us in His image so that we could discover the truth. And the fact that we can discover this truth is a proof of the existence of an intelligent Creator who made us, who not only made the world. Think of the prayer we pray before each of our lessons. God who not only made the world and surrounded us with the mysteries of the universe, but He gave us the faculties to understand the order that's present in them. He gave us the faculties, He gave us the powers that we need to understand Him, to see that order, and through that order to see Him as the cause of all causes, the first cause of all of this order. Porphyry continues, these are especially useful, this understanding and knowledge of differences. These are especially useful in the divisions of genera and in definitions. But this is not the case with differences which are inseparable from accident, and much less those which are separable. So here Porphyry emphasizes the importance of specific differences, and again, the importance of being able to identify specific differences for the work of philosophy and science. Only specific differences are useful for creating proper classifications and definitions. That is, specific differences are necessary for understanding the truth. Accidental differences, even if they're inseparable, so more permanent accidental differences, they're not going to help us understand what things really are. Separable differences, which are the loosest, they're even less useful for the purpose of understanding what things really are. This again is going to help us in the future to understand why true knowledge focuses on essences and necessary properties rather than accidental features. And this is what it means to develop the mind of a wise man. You learn to give attention to what is essential and not to what is accidental. You learn to see through the accidental, to fix your mind on what is essential. This is what in classical arithmetic we learn is called reality by Pythagoras. That which never changes is reality. That which is always changing to Pythagoras is considered not to be real. A wise man sees what is essential and more or less ignores what is accidental, especially when he's seeking to understand the truth of things. Porphyry continues, these also defining, they say difference is that by which species is more abundant than genus. Difference is that by which species is more abundant than genus. Thus, man has more than animal in consequence of being rational and mortal. For animal is neither any one of these, nor has it all opposite differences. But as they conceive, it contains in capacity all the differences which are under it, but possesses no one of them in energy. Notice the distinction between capacity and energy. Thus, neither is anything generated from non-entities, nor will opposites subsist at once about the same thing. Now, that's a very heavy section to read there, philosophically. Lots of foreign concepts which are difficult for new students to wrap their minds around. But what Porphyry does here is he gives us a formal definition of difference, just like he's given us formal definitions of genus and species. He now gives us a formal definition of difference. The first, or actually several definitions of difference. The first definition says that difference is what makes a species more abundant. A strange term. Difference is what makes species more abundant or more specific than its genus. And here's what he means by more abundant. Man, the species, includes everything that animal includes, plus the additional differences of rational and mortal. Man includes everything that animal includes, plus the additional differences of rational and mortal. That's why man is said to be more abundant than animal. The genus animal cannot actually possess the specific differences, because then all animals would have those differences and there would be no species. Animal, the genus, contains the differences, quote unquote, in capacity. Animal contains the differences in capacity. It has the potential to be divided by them into species. Animal contains the differences in capacity or in potential. And we can see here that we've come to the Aristotelian and Thomistic idea of potency and act, how it relates to these concepts of the predicables of genus and species and difference. Animal contains the differences, the specific differences of man in potential, and they are actualized or realized in the species man. The genus exists in potency to its various actualizations in species. And I know that's very philosophical and not very helpful, but I want you to remember when we read the Summa or get into Aristotle's philosophy in the future, and we start seeing these words actual and potential, I want you to remember that we talked about these things in chapter 3 of Porphyry's Introduction, and to come back here and review this chapter, and it will all make clearer and clearer sense as you continue in your studies. Let's keep going, though, with Porphyry. He says, quote, "They, being the philosophers, also define difference as follows." So here's another formal definition. Difference is that which is predicated of many things, differing in species, in answer to the question, what kind of a thing is this? Now you can see, if you studied chapter 2 with me, you can see that that sounds very familiar. It sounds just like how the definitions were formed for genus and species. Difference is that which is predicated of many things. We saw that all of the predicables are predicated of many things. but differing in species. So it's not like species, because species is not predicated, nor is peculiarity or property. They're not predicated of things differing in species. Genus is predicated of things differing in species, and here difference is predicated of things differing in species. And notice, in answer to a different question than genus and species, in answer to the question, what kind of a thing is this? Thus, Porphyry says, rational and mortal, when predicated of man, are predicated in answer to the question, what kind of a thing is man? Not in answer to the question, what is man? That's an important distinction. That's what separates difference from genus and species. Genus and species answer the question, what is man? Difference answers the question, what kind of a thing is man? When we're asked, what is man? We answer an animal. We name the genus. But when we're asked, what kind of an animal is man? We reply that he is a rational animal, a mortal animal. We give the differences. Because since things consist of matter and form, as we'll learn in Aristotle, in natural philosophy, since things consist of matter and form, or from things which are analogous to matter and form, as a statue is composed from brass as matter, but from figure, the figure of the statue, as form, thus also man. Both the common and specific consists from genus, which is analogous to matter, and from difference, which is analogous to form. This whole, however, namely animal, rational, mortal, when we put all those together, is man, in the same manner as the statue there. And you'll find this image of the statue used commonly in philosophy to signify what it means to exist. We look at this statue, let's say we see a statue of George Washington that's made out of marble. And we ask, what is the material cause of this statue? What is the matter? And we say, well, it's marble. But marble has nothing to do with George Washington. Marble is just the matter. What makes it to be George Washington, what makes the statue to be a statue of George Washington, is not the matter, but the form. And when the matter, the marble, and the form, the design, or the image of George Washington, when they come together, then we have a statue of George Washington, when matter and form come together. So in the second definition, and again, the definition is difference is that which is predicated of many things, differing in species, in answer to the question what kind of a thing this is. This definition focuses on the logical function of difference in answering questions. Difference answers the question what kind rather than what is it. And this difference, this distinction, I should say, because the word difference is going to get confusing, we're using it too much. This distinction is crucial because it shows how genus and difference work together in definitions. The genus tells us what something is in general. The difference tells us what kind of thing it is specifically. Genus tells us what it is in general. The difference tells us what it is specifically. And the analogy that Porphyry uses to matter and form is very important for understanding Aristotle and scholastic philosophy. Just as a statue is composed of matter, whether it's bronze or marble or anything else, The statue is composed of matter and form, or the actual shape and design of the statue. In the same way, Porphyry says, a species is composed of genus, what it is in general, just like the material of a statue, and also the difference, which is like the form of the statue. Very helpful illustration. And this makes clear for us this fundamental Aristotelian or Thomistic principle that's known as hylomorphism. Hylomorphism, the coming together of matter and form. And we see where it comes from here in the art of logic, in logical classification. So this is really laying a foundation for us for future philosophical studies. Very, very important stuff. And I don't expect you as students to understand all of this, but what's very important is that you learn where these things are discussed so that later in your studies, if you're serious and you pursue wisdom, you can remember where you heard that before or where you read about this topic before, and you can go back to these passages and read them and really clarify your understanding of what's taught in the philosophical and even theological sciences later in your studies. Porphyry continues and says, they also, the philosophers also describe difference as follows. So here's another definition. Difference is that which is naturally adapted to separate things which are arranged under the same genus. Thus, rational and irrational separate man and horse, which are under the same genus, namely animal. Difference is that which is naturally adapted to separate things which are arranged under the same genus. This is now a third definition of difference, and it emphasizes the separating or distinguishing function that difference has. The separating function of difference. Differences allow us to distinguish between different species within the same genus. This is essential for thinking clearly, understanding the distinctions between things, and also for properly classifying things, being able to handle classification, logical classification. If we don't understand clearly what differences are, we can't distinguish between different kinds of animals. We don't even know what to look for. We don't know where to begin. We can see that something is an animal. We can describe it in a sloppy way, but we can't really think about it clearly or properly classify it unless we understand differences. All of our knowledge, if we didn't understand the differences, all of our knowledge would just be vague and general, like referring to every statue as marble. That's what our thinking and conversation would be like. And we see that this is what people struggle with. You'll see people say like, oh, I can't describe, I've got this idea, but I just can't express it. That's because they don't have the vocabulary and the clarity of ideas to be able to communicate effectively, to think clearly. Porphyry continues. They likewise, again, explain difference thus. Difference is that by which everything differs. Difference is that by which everything differs. For man and horse do not indeed differ according to genus, for both we, man, and horses are animals, but the addition of rational separates us from them. We and angels are rational, but the addition of mortal separates men from angels. So here this fourth definition is the most general. It's very, very broad. Difference is simply that which causes things to differ. Difference is simply that by which things differ. Porphyry shows us how this works in a systematic way. Man and horse share the same genus. They're both animal. But they differ by rationality. Rationality is difference because it is that by which two things differ, according to this definition. Man and angels share rationality. But what causes them to differ is mortality. Man is mortal, angels are not mortal. Angels are immortal. This shows how differences work at different levels to create precise distinctions between different kinds of things. Porphyry continues and says, those, however, who more elegantly discuss what pertains to difference do not say that difference is anything casual which separates things under the same genus, but they assert it to be that which contributes to the essence and the very nature of a thing, which is part of a thing. Thus, to be naturally adapted to sail is not the difference of man, though it is a peculiarity of man. For one may say that of animals, some are naturally adapted to sail, but others are not. And this may separate man from other animals. But a natural ability of sailing doesn't give completion or clarity to the essence of man, nor is it a part of his essence, but is alone an aptitude of it, an ability. Because it is not such a difference as those which are called specific differences. Hence, specific differences will be those which produce another species, and which are assumed in explaining in what the very nature of a thing consists. So Porphyry here concludes with an important refinement, we could say. He speaks of those who speak more elegantly on the subject. Not every quality that separates things or that causes things to differ in the same genus counts as a true difference in the philosophical sense. True specific differences must contribute to the essence and the nature of the thing. The ability to sail might separate men from other animals, just like the ability to laugh. But it's not essential to being human. It's just a peculiarity or a property that follows from our essential nature. Only differences that are part of the essence itself count as specific differences for the purposes of definition and classification, which is what we're concerned with in philosophy. So when it comes to philosophy, to sum up this third chapter here, when it comes to the study of philosophy, where we're concerned with definition and classification and identifying the true nature of things, it's this concept of the specific difference that we're really concerned with. And that's the importance. That's the message of this third chapter. And then finally, Porphyry concludes saying, thus much may suffice concerning difference. Thus much may suffice concerning difference. And I'm sure you feel the same way. Porphyry concludes that this treatment of difference has given us a complete framework for understanding this third predicable, which is a crucial concept in logic and philosophy. If we understand these concepts in the right way, we'll be able to move into Aristotelian philosophy and later into Christian philosophy or scholastic philosophy and understand what's going on, understand what these philosophers are talking about. So that brings us to the end of Chapter 3. I'd like to, as I always do, provide you with some points for memory work, some points that are worth memorizing, and I'm going to give you 10. We're already at an hour and 25 minutes, so I'm going to read through them just once. So 10 points worth memorizing. You can pause the video and listen to them and jot them down if you want. Number 1. Difference is predicated in 3 ways: in common, peculiarly, and most peculiarly. Number 2. Common difference occurs when things differ in any respect from themselves or other things. Number 3. Peculiar difference occurs through inseparable accidents like eye color or nose shape. Number 4. Most peculiar difference is specific difference, which makes things essentially different kinds. Number 5. Specific differences cause things to be other things, while simple differences cause changes in quality only. Number 6. Some differences are separable and others are inseparable. Number 7. Inseparable differences are either essential or accidental. Number 8. Essential differences are included in definitions and do not admit of degrees. Number 9. Accidental differences are not included in definitions and can vary in degree. And lastly, number 10. Specific differences are used to divide genera into species and to constitute definitions. Those are our 10 points for memory work. So, in this lecture, we have very carefully and completely studied Chapter 3 of Porphyry's Introduction, in which he discusses the third predicable, difference. We've discussed 3 different types of difference: common, peculiar, and most peculiar. We've looked at the distinction between separable and inseparable differences. We've looked at the difference between essential and accidental differences. And we also looked practically at how specific differences are used in definitions and classifications and how important that is for our study of philosophy and the art of reasoning. So, having gone through all of that, now it's time for you to reread the lesson. Reread and study the actual text of Porphyry's Introduction, Chapter 3, and work to develop your understanding of the lesson, all of its content, every sentence, every word, and demonstrate that understanding through the various assessments that are provided in the lesson: quiz, general assessment, comprehension assessment, and so on. If you have any questions as you're studying, anything you need help with, anything that's not clear, please get in touch. You can contact me anytime. I recommend you do so by email. Just write to me at mail@classicalliberalarts.com. I'm happy to help. If you're studying, if you're putting in the work to study, I will help you as much as you need. So please, anytime you have a question, anytime you need help, just get in touch. Once again, for all who are listening, whether you're enrolled or not enrolled, my name is William Michael. I'm the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, which you can learn more about at classicalliberalarts.com. I hope this lesson has been helpful. Good luck with your studies. God bless.